Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the Retreat of Nonprofits, Influence on Systems and Policy. My name is Dr. Akilah Watkins, and I am the President and CEO of Independent Sector. On behalf of Independent Sector, I would like to extend a warm welcome to our members and guests. Before we begin, I ask that you join me in a moment of reflection to respectfully acknowledge all Native American and Indigenous peoples who lived on the lands that we occupy today. Independent Sector is based in Washington, D.C., the ancestral home of the Nancotek, the Anacostan, and the Piscataway people who continue to live in the area and are working to reclaim their land and traditional practices. I also want to acknowledge that many of the buildings and places we inhabit in Washington were built with the labor of enslaved people. Thank you. Nonprofits are a catalyst for democracy and systems change in the US. Our organizations bring individuals together to educate leaders, particularly policymakers, about our missions, community challenges, and potential solutions. Nonprofits also help people use their own voice to share their stories, call for change, and hold leaders accountable. Independent Sector commissioned nationally representative research to fill a 20-year gap in data around nonprofit advocacy and civic engagement activities. Our new research will help nonprofit leaders and policymakers see what, if any, progress has been made in nonprofit advocacy during the last 2 decades. It also establishes a new baseline for nonprofit advocacy and civic engagement, which includes new metrics on nonprofits, nonpartisan civic engagement, digital engagement, and diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Today, we'll unpack our research findings with the help of the report's authors. Dr. Louis Falk, Associate Professor at the School of Public Affairs at American University. Dr. Marie Kim, Associate Professor and MPA Director at the SCAR School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. Dr. Heather McIndoe, Associate Professor and PhD Program Director at the McCormick Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And our wonderful panelist, Gary Bass, President of GDB Consulting. He is a Senior Fellow at the Democracy Fund, Executive Director Emeritus of the Bauman Foundation, and Adjunct Professor at Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy, where he teaches about social change and advocacy. Gary is one of the authors of the only other nationally representative survey on nonprofit advocacy conducted more than 20 years ago. The 2000 Strengthening Nonprofit Advocacy Project, or SNAP. Mercedes Brown is the Director of Race Equity Assessment at the Building Movement Project. In this new role, she is charged with launching and bringing to scale BMP's new organizational race equity assessment process to better equip the nonprofit sector with the foundational capacities needed to build more racially equitable workspaces. Mercedes is also a member of the Independent Sector's Public Policy Committee. And then we have Amanda Caron, who is the Director of Advocacy and Public Policy at Cornerstones. In this role, she leads Cornerstones' work to create systemic change through advocacy for budget investments, policy changes, and civic engagement in our local communities. She uses organizing principles to bring together advocates, partners, and leaders across sectors to advocate for priorities including affordable homes, school success, economic security, health, and well-being for all members of our community. Thank you for joining us today. I'd like to hand things over to Emily Rogers, Independent Sector's Manager of Policy Research.
Thanks, Akilah. A few logistical notes before we get started. Today's webinar is being recorded and closed captioning is enabled. Our program is broken into 3 sections, each covering different findings from the report. Each section will begin with a brief overview of the findings and reactions from our panelists, followed by an audience Q&A segment. At any time during today's session, please share your thoughts and reactions in the chat, and please submit any questions using the Q&A function. If your question isn't answered during the Q&A segments, we'll do our best to address it in our follow-up email. Now that we've grounded our approach, I'd like to turn things over to Dr. Louis Falk to discuss the current state of nonprofit advocacy and public engagement.
Thank you, Emily and Akila, and thank you to Independent Sector for hosting us today. I am Louis Falk at American University, and I'm a part of the research team. I'm going to be starting off our presentation. So we have a series of short presentations, and my section is going to be focused on the current state of nonprofit advocacy and public engagement, and really trying to compare, especially our findings to the findings 20 years ago that Gary Bass, Jeffrey Berry, and others conducted through the SNAP project. I'd like to acknowledge all the institutions that are partnered on this research project. Thanks to Independent Sector as a primary sponsor. And also, in addition to the academic institutions at the bottom, where the research team are housed, we'd like to acknowledge and thank SSRS, which is a survey research firm that actually administered the survey after we developed it. And they conducted the fielding from July of last year to December, all the way through the end of the year 2022. So the first question here is, what is the current state of advocacy in the sector? Our survey is representative of charitable nonprofits, so all 501c3 organizations that file with the IRS. And this, as mentioned before, this representative survey or findings like this have not been conducted in 20 years since the SNAP survey project. And so we're trying to understand, what is the current state and how have things changed, both in terms of frequency and engagement in public affairs, but also understanding the laws of engagement. We had a section of the survey that asked specifically, we asked executive directors and other leaders who were taking the survey to report on these 2 primary activities. This was later in the survey after we asked a series of other questions to assess knowledge and understanding, but we really wanted to ground our knowledge on some specific definitions, since definitions really matter, as Gary Bass and Jeffrey Berry found in the SNAP survey. So these were the 2 primary definitions that we asked respondents to read and respond to in terms of one of the main indicators of engagement. So lobbying, which we define as taking a specific position on specific legislation at any of those at the levels of local, state, or federal, and also communicating that position to legislators and their staff. Policy advocacy is broader than lobbying. It can include lobbying, but it includes any other attempts to influence government policy, which can also include educational or public education types of initiatives, research, or other types of activities to raise awareness around issues. So much more general. What do we find? Well, we find that overall, around a little less than a third of nonprofits today report engaging in either policy advocacy and or lobbying as we just defined in the last 5 years, right? And for the most part, the organizations that are engaged in these activities are mostly engaged in more general advocacy without lobbying. So that's around 18% of the sector. And then we have another 13% of organizations that are engaged in lobbying, most often in addition to general advocacy itself. However, the most striking finding is that close to 70% of organizations today are not engaged in either policy advocacy or lobbying. When we compare these findings to the SNAP survey in the year 2000, we find these striking differences, right? And so other sections of the survey, we actually replicated many of the questions that were fielded in the SNAP survey so we could directly compare different types of engagement from organizations. And this is where we find some really striking differences, and primarily that there's a lot less engagement today than there was 20 years ago. So as an example, 86% of nonprofits surveyed 20 years ago indicated that they were engaged in lobbying, testifying, or encouraging members to contact policymakers. Today, we find that when we ask about those specific forms of engagement and activities, only 48% of nonprofits today report ever having engaged in any of those activities. So a striking difference in terms of the decline in engagement in those activities. And importantly, that includes only a quarter of the sector today that has reported ever engaging in any form of lobbying, compared to almost 3/4 of organizations in the year 2000. And we find that a lot of this comes from, or is at least directly related to, a lack of understanding of the laws. And this was also reported in the SNAP survey to a certain extent. And what we've done here is we compared the findings from the SNAP survey project in the year 2000, and the gray bars, to the findings from our 2022 survey on nonprofit understanding of the laws today. And as you can see across the board, there are significant differences in organizations' understanding of the laws. You'll note that the two types of engagement that nonprofits are not allowed to do, so using government funds to lobby Congress or to endorse a political candidate for office, organizations today actually know that they can't do that, and more organizations today know that they can't do that than 20 years ago. However, when we look at any of the forms of engagement where organizations are allowed to engage legally, such as talking to elected officials, supporting or opposing federal regulations or federal legislation, or any other forms of engagement that organizations are legally allowed to do, we find that organizations are significantly less knowledgeable of these laws. And as an example, in the middle there, where organizations report whether they can support or oppose federal legislation, we find that less than 1/3 of organizations actually know that they can, and that directly correlates with less than 1/3 of organizations that actually are engaged in that way. Similar to the SNAP survey, we find significant variation across the sector. We do find that certain fields of activity, certain mission areas, nonprofits are more heavily engaged in policy engagement. This includes environment and healthcare. And human services organizations, which represent the largest segment of the nonprofit sector, human service organizations generally report engagement around the average for all organizations. And then certain organizations are less engaged, and we see that specifically with education, arts and culture, religion, and international organizations. Also similar to the SNAP survey, we find that size is a real barrier, specifically that smaller organizations, less than $1 million in annual revenue and expenses, these organizations make up the bulk of the sector. And these are organizations that are operating primarily on the local level and in communities, directly impacting communities and working with the most marginalized in society. For the most part, these small organizations are not engaged in policy advocacy or lobbying, whether it be on the local level, state level, or federal level. So similar to the SNAP survey findings, we find that this capacity to engage is directly related to knowledge and understanding on being able to engage. And we find that the bulk of the sector, the vast majority of the sector, is not knowledgeable on their rights and legal ability to engage in this way. And unsurprisingly, those organizations are not engaged in policy and advocacy. I'll turn it over here to Emily for a panel discussion.
Thanks, Louis. All right, I'd like to turn to our panelists for their reactions to this data, starting with Gary. As one of the authors of the 2000 Strengthening Nonprofit Advocacy Project, or SNAP study, that provided the data we're benchmarking against. What are your reactions to these findings?
Well, first, thank you, Emily, and Independent Sector and the whole PENS team for doing this important research. My first reaction after listening to Lewis is, holy cow, how can this be? I mean, I look at newspapers and I look at the local, state, and national news, including social media. And I see nonprofits deeply engaged in social action. So it feels like nonprofits are more engaged than ever. And when I've described the SNAP data from the last 2 decades ago to my graduate students, I get a reaction, oh, those data are way out of date. And and I described the SNAP data as sort of a good news, bad news story. It was good news that charities were engaged in shaping public policy, and here's the bad news, they did it infrequently or episodically. And immediately my graduate students would say, oh, but if you look at IRS Form 990 data, it shows an increase in lobbying expenses over the past couple of decades. So clearly they're much more engaged than ever before. So I imagine those of us who are on this session today, who are listening, are going to be immediately talking about, well, were the definitions the same? Or the methodological differences, weren't there different ways that you did things that could explain why PENS found dramatically lower participation than SNAP? But frankly, PENS, and there were methodological differences here and there, but I got to say the PENS team tried to adjust for many of those factors, and still policy participation declined. Fewer charities engage in advocacy today than 2 decades ago. Now, maybe, Emily, some of this is understandable if we think about the nonprofit infrastructure from 20 years ago to compared to today. Keep in mind, there were attacks on nonprofit advocacy starting with the Reagan administration in the early 1980s. There were congressional, particularly the House of Representatives, launched attacks during the Contract with America years, that is the mid-1990s. So in the lead up to the SNAP research, there were organizations that championed nonprofit advocacy rights. There were organizations providing training and technical support on what's permissible activities. Groups like Alliance for Justice, Independent Sector, OMB Watch, Charity Lobbying in the Public Interest, and what was then a growing network of state nonprofit associations were all deeply engaged. And today, except for Alliance for Justice and maybe some of the state nonprofit associations, the emphasis on training around nonprofit advocacy has changed, if not evaporated. So on the one hand, the way I look at this is we have reduced emphasis on training about what's permissible, and sprinkle in now the fact that you've had staff turnover in charities over the last couple of decades. And it's no wonder, if there's less knowledge about advocacy in the IRS lobbying rules, less knowledge means there's going to be less engagement. Nonprofits aren't likely to tackle activities where they're uncertain what the rules are. By the way, just before I stop here, we should keep in mind a unique feature of American democracy is the role of the voluntary sector. Associations and charities have been doing policy advocacy, civic engagement since the founding of this country. It's baked into our national DNA. Many of the laws and regulations, from voting rights to education with those with disabilities, to environmental protections, to take your pick, consumer safety, were shaped by nonprofits. That's why the PENS data is vitally important. While comparing SNAP data and PENS data may not be an exact match, the trend is clear. A key takeaway is that it appears there's a significant drop in activities associated with policy advocacy undertaken by charities for over the past 2 decades. So Emily, this is indeed disappointing news, if not a clearing call for action.
Thank you, Gary. Mercedes and Amanda, I want to hop over to you all. Did this data surprise you? What do you think influenced how we got here? Mercedes, we'll start with you.
Yes, thank you. And thanks to IS for having me, and to the full team for advancing this very important research. First, I'll say, unfortunately, it doesn't surprise me that we continue to observe low advocacy engagement, as well as a lack of understanding of the applicable laws and regulations that govern nonprofit advocacy. I believe that this is, to Gary's point, like something that is disheartening, something that we should be concerned about, and more importantly, an issue that we should double down on addressing as vigorously as we possibly can. And given that the deeply entrenched social inequities are perpetuated by unjust policies and underinvestment in social services, we can't afford not to. It's not an option. Since the nonprofit sector, on top of that, is the third largest employer in the United States, and the fact that the sector demonstrates a lack of understanding of what's appropriate and how to advance their mission through actual systems change rather than providing direct services, I think we're in trouble. Like, I just don't want to echo that sentiment. That failure puts at risk nonprofit employees as well as the larger communities in which they serve. But I do think that on a more encouraging note, I look forward to having this conversation about the promising practices and bright spots that the research, I believe, will uplift, that may contribute to further building out the capacity of the nonprofit sector to more effectively understand how to advocate and engage in more regular and consistent advocacy. I think at the Building Movement Project, we've seen through more recently our COVID-19 research that there are nonprofits leading and participating in advocacy and organizing efforts to advance racial equity and justice. I think one thing that sort of pops top of mind for me is the uprisings of 2020 against anti-Black racism have galvanized POC or persons of color-led organizations to build cross-racial coalitions and to push for systemic and structural changes. I think Gary did an incredible job, Emily, touching on all the reasons why we might observe that decline. So I thought I might spend a little bit more time just echoing the sentiment that it's not surprising and it is concerning. And I look forward to diving into some of the other questions and data that you all are going to lay out today that show that there are some places where it's happening more, and look forward to being part of further qualitative investigative efforts to better understand and amplify that, as that might serve as a model for the larger sector.
Great, thanks, Mercedes. Amanda?
Sure. I would just share that I think that this information resonates. You know, we're lucky here at Cornerstones that we have a leadership team and board of directors who have really prioritized advocacy and systems change. But I think I hear even internally in our organization that both capacity and lack of engagement continue to be barriers to getting involved in this kind of work. You know, there's limited staff, limited funds for advocacy work. And, you know, when we hear from coworkers that often they don't understand what they can and can't do, we hear things like a distaste for politics and the current political environment, feeling intimidated by advocacy work and just not feeling like they can make a difference. It's just made it challenging.
Thanks, Amanda. Now I'd like to touch on some questions from the audience. Please do continue to submit any questions you have through the Q&A function and share your reactions and thoughts in the chat. So we've got a couple that are indeed methodological, but I think I'm going to start with one we just got. Can you speak to the impact of extreme political polarization and reliance on government or certain large philanthropic funders where nonprofits may feel they cannot take a position without the fear of retribution? Does anyone want to touch that one?
I'll just start here just to tee it up. You know, I don't think there's an easy answer to this question. I think it's a really astute one. But I do think that general fear in the boardroom, potentially among executive directors, is something that holds organizations back, either fear of you know, upsetting a donor or fear of you know, broader implications for organizations that are highly public and highly active. I don't think that's a fear that should necessarily be acted on. It's clear that organizations that do engage externally, especially in policy and advocacy, to engage with their mission outside of their direct programs, those are organizations that are highly effective, that are making a difference in the systems change that they're really trying to make through their programs.
And there's I might add, in our survey data, we found that those who rely relatively more on government funding, they have reported they engage in advocacy and lobbying to a larger extent than those that rely less on government funding. So that actually surprised us. But at the same time, that's consistent with the findings in the SNAP survey 20 years ago.
And I'd add one more thing, because this question is sort of looking forward. We do have information about whether a nonprofit was located in a red state or a blue state. And we have found that blue state nonprofits engage in advocacy at higher rates. But that's something that's sort of beyond the scope of this webinar. But I wanted to mention that we do have data that we're looking into that hopefully we can delve more into this question.
If I could just jump in on the funder portion of it, assuming the references to philanthropic funding as opposed to the government funding that Maria was talking about. It does seem to me that funders have more to do. I mean, let's face it, that foundations need to be more engaged on advocacy, social change, movement building, et cetera. But I also think they have been making strides forward. You see many foundations engaging in ways they hadn't 20 years ago. Having said that, the polarization and extreme dimensions of today's landscape really do present problems that are very difficult. Mercedes, you talked about the importance of addressing equity issues. Well, in today's world, even addressing racial equity turns into a red and a blue issue immediately. And for funders, that puts them in a very difficult dilemma. So it's a challenging environment that we're in when you have this extreme polarization.
Thanks, Gary, and thanks to the research team. I want to dive a little bit deeper into this question. I think one of the questions, we got a similar question come in. How much of this decline is attributable to the political environment that we're in? Louis, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I'll just follow up with what Gary just mentioned. We don't know. We don't have a lot of data on how the exact changes in the political environment are affecting nonprofit participation. But we do have findings such as, when organizations depend more heavily on individual donors, those are the organizations that are least engaged, right? So we do have findings that at least suggest, same kinds of implications that Gary was pointing to, that there may be a, hesitation to engage in what could be politically charged or seen as politically charged when you depend more heavily on more general public to support you. We don't know exactly that pathway and exactly if that's what's going on. I suspect it's a mix that, a lot of the findings that we have point to what Gary was mentioning. There's been turnover in the sector in terms of executive leadership. There's not as much education that is going on in an ongoing way across the sector to make sure organizations know that they can use policy engagement as a strategy to impact their mission. Again, we find important disparities with smaller organizations being least knowledgeable and least engaged here. But those are also the organizations that are depending most heavily on individual donors.
Thanks, Louis. We have time for one more question, and I wanted to get into a methodological one with you. So the report mentions that the 2000 SNAP survey intentionally oversampled 501H electors and organizations that reported lobbying expenses on their Form 990. The question is asking if this skews the conclusion about the reduction. Can you speak to that disparity?
I can briefly, and then if Murray or Heather, you want to jump in, or Gary, if you want to follow up as well. So we were intentional about following the same sampling methodology generally. So the sample frame is as closely the same as we could in 2022 as was done in the SNAP survey. So we excluded hospitals and higher education from the sample frame. We included all other 501c3s that were filing with the IRS that were over the filing threshold, so $50,000 in annual revenue today. That said, we did not oversample 501H electors or organizations that were reporting lobbying expenses to the IRS on their 990. We did that intentionally to have a broader swath of the sector to understand overall changes. However, we were able to hand code all of the organizations that did report lobbying expenses to the IRS in our sample and organizations that were H electors. And even when we compare those organizations to the findings of the SNAP survey, they're significantly lower rates of participation and other forms that we're seeing here. So it's a great question, and it's something that we really dove into to really try to understand these differences. But as Gary mentioned, even when we're controlling for those factors, we still see a decline in understanding and engagement.
Just as speaking from the SNAP point of view, I try to pick apart the Penn research as much as I could to make sure where was the flaw, if you will. And I think you guys did a great job, and your explanation, Lewis, was spot on here. It was accurate that you were able to still see in the non-501H from ours and yours, a comparison, you saw a significant decline. I mean, there are other methodological differences, and there are things that are happened. Again, the nonprofit sector grew much larger. The charity community may be smaller in size, which leads to less involvement. I think one of the big changes that you did that we didn't do is you asked for the name of the organization. And it may be that some organizations are nervous if they don't know the rules to even indicate that they're doing some activities that they don't know if it's allowable. But these are going to be on the margin, which you found were significant differences.
Thank you all. I'm going to hand things over to Dr. Murray Kim to present on findings about who are the nonprofits that are actually advocating and what our research found related to equity. As a reminder, if we didn't get to your question, we'll do our best to answer it in the follow-up email, and please do continue to submit questions.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you for giving me the chance to present some of the findings that in the report. So I'm Mira Kim at George Mason University. I will talk about which organizations advocate more than others and how that relates their commitment to equity issues. So our 2022 advocacy survey asked nonprofits if they have an official written DEI statement. We asked this because even though we fully acknowledge that having a DEI statement does not guarantee an organization's full commitment to DEI, having an official written statement could still demonstrate its dedication and an organization's intention to bolstering equity within a community. So that's why we asked to see if they have an intentional commitment. And we found that of our organizations, 63% of them have an officially written DEI statement. But even though a majority of them have a DEI statement, only 36% of those with a DEI statement engage in advocacy or lobbying to actually create more equitable systems through policy changes. That we also found that there is a statistically significant difference between those engaged in advocacy and lobbying and those not engaged when it comes to having an official DEI statement. So about 74% of nonprofits engaged in policy say that they have a DEI statement. On the other hand, about 58% of non-policy engaged nonprofits, meaning that they are not engaged in lobbying and advocacy, that they have a DEI statement. So once again, let me reiterate that having a written statement is different from having an organization resource dedicated to the DEI initiative, even though that could signify an organization's intention. So for that reason, we further compared to what extent they actually dedicate resources for DEI initiatives. So as shown on the table here, if a nonprofit has an official DEI statement, that the organization is more likely to dedicate its resources to DEI, which we measured in terms of budget commitment, staff time, and board volunteer committee work. It is probably not surprising to most of you that the resource dedication rates are lower when organizations do not have a DEI statement that represent their intentional commitment. So for instance, about 45% of nonprofits that have a written DEI statement engage in advocacy and lobbying, whereas only 32% of those without a DEI statement engage in advocacy and lobbying. We can look at the relationship between policy engagement and DEI commitment in a different way. So nearly 40% of nonprofits say that they have a DEI statement, but these 40% are the ones that do not engage in advocacy or lobbying. So I'm talking about 40% out of the entire nonprofits. So that suggests that there are some organizations that may be feeling more comfortable expressing those policy interests within their own organization, expressing their DEI commitment within the organization, rather than expressing and materializing externally. So alternatively, that also suggests that there may be more opportunities to engage more organization in related to systematic changes through policy issues beyond their organization's former boundaries. And there are some organizations, about 8% of the sector, that do engage in advocacy and lobbying, but do not have an officially written dedicated DEI commitment. And it must be noted that without a clear formalized commitment to DEI with a written statement that they publish, there may be a risk that these nonprofits are not fully aligned with the best practices, or maybe perceived as insincere. But more importantly, that there is a chance that their resources can be easily repurposed once their focus changes. Policy engagement can provide an avenue for organizations to advocate for changes to laws, including those related to DEI issues. Policy engagement can also help reinforce an organization's commitment to DEI by providing opportunities for networking, learning, collaboration with others. It's also possible that an organization's commitment to DEI is one of the factors that drives their policy engagement, or those policy engagement influence organizational practice. So that means it's likely that the relationship is mutually reinforcing. As part of our quest for who advocates, we looked at leadership traits at nonprofits. So similar to the findings in another recent national study of nonprofit, we found that roughly 1 in 5 nonprofit is currently led by POC executive director, and about 22% of them have a person of color serving as their board chair, and 12% have both POC executive director and POC board chair. When we compare their policy engagement rate, depending on their leadership trait, we found that nonprofits led by POC executive directors had a policy engagement rate at 29%, while those led by non-POC executives had a 31% participation rate. So this difference did not appear to be statistically significant. However, we found that board chair characteristics made a statistically significant difference. About 32% of nonprofits with white board chairs participate in advocacy and lobbying, compared to about 26% of nonprofit with a POC board chair. Also, even though it's not appearing on the slide, you'd find it interesting that we also found evidence that nonprofits located in POC majority community have a higher advocacy engagement rate as compared to those located in non-POC majority community. Then when we looked at the leadership gender aspect, we found those organizations with female executive directors are slightly more likely to engage in advocacy. That's slight difference, but still statistically significant difference in policy engagement rate between female executive-led versus male executive-led. And that could mean that having a female executive director positively influence an organization's advocacy and lobbying efforts. And certainly this is an area that we need more research to better understand the underlying reasons, but still an important finding to note. So also as a way of knowing which organization advocate and which don't, we asked nonprofits a variety of factors that mostly encourage or mostly discourage their organization when trying to influence public policy. What we found is that regardless of their current engagement in advocacy or lobbying, nonprofits generally find their mission and organizations' attitude toward advocacy, activities that coalition or membership associations do, organizations' attitude toward local, state, or federal policy decisions, and donor preferences to be mostly encouraging factors. On the other hand, the receipt of government funding, organizations' own capacity, tax laws or IS rules are found to be mostly discouraging factor for their participation in advocacy and lobbying. And I must say that during the survey, many organizations that are not currently engaged in advocacy and lobbying checked that most of these factors listed here are simply not relevant, rather than saying either encouraging or discouraging. That means that the biggest barrier for those non-participants is that their perspective that advocacy and or lobbying is simply not relevant to what they do, simply not relevant to their mission. And this chart simply further describe those motivating or discouraging factors across different subsectors. An average value between 0 and 1 means that the group generally views the factor as mostly encouraging factor for their policy engagement. And an average value between 0 and -1 means that the group generally views the factor as mostly discouraging. An average value that's close to 0 suggests the group generally views the factor as mostly not applicable. So just to point out a few, attitudes toward advocacy and policy decisions are generally seen as positive, with encouraging scores ranging between 0.03 to 0.26 across all sectors. Mission is universally seen as a positive factor and across our subsectors. And approximately 70% of policy engaged nonprofits say that their mission encourages their engagement. For nonprofits that do not engage in lobbying or advocacy, 56% of them report that policy engagement is not applicable to their mission. And 18% believe that their mission discourages advocacy, and this 18% of those currently not engaged believe that their mission discourages from engaging in advocacy and lobbying. And most subsectors find organization capacity to be discouraging, and donor preference found to be vary by subsector. They are seen as slightly encouraging by some subsectors, but slightly discouraging for some other subsectors like religious subsector. Government funding shows a neutral effect on most subsectors, with the scores hovering around 0 and within 0.1 range. The human service subsector, as compared to other subsectors, found government funding to be a little more encouraging as compared to other subsectors. Tax law or IS rules are not well received by any of these subsectors and showing negative scores. So in summary, these findings provide some insight into various factors that influence nonprofit organization. But the key takeaway is that the mission is the biggest factor that influences an organization's decision to engage or not engage, which is consistent with the SNAP findings in 20 years ago. So I will stop here and hand it back to Emily for discussion.
Thanks, Mireille. So we're talking about organizations that see that connect with their mission, who are the ones who are actually advocating. So I wanted to talk a little bit to Amanda. Cornerstones is a mid-sized organization with a mission to promote self-sufficiency for providing support and advocacy for those in need of food, shelter, affordable housing, quality childcare, and other human services. Can you tell us more about your organization and why advocacy is part of your mission and what that looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. So here at Cornerstones, we really try to walk with individuals and families along this journey from crisis to self-sufficiency to thriving through our various programs and services. And while we're deeply invested in this work and serve many people in our community each year through these programs and services, we know that our reach can only really go so far through this direct service work. And so by engaging in systems change and advocacy, we can work to dismantle systemic barriers that prevent these families from thriving. Really, this allows us to maximize our impact and create greater change. As a human services organization, really we're well positioned for advocacy because of our connections in the community, our understanding of the experiences of our clients, and our ability to bring voices of lived experience to the table. So our work is led by an advocacy committee made up largely of current and former board members and supported by members of our staff. And we've identified platform issues that we know are areas in need of our advocacy here to help support the community members that we serve. So our platform includes issues like affordable homes, what we call connected and resilient children and families, health and well-being, and economic security for our workforce. Civic engagement is also an important piece of our advocacy work. We do voter outreach as well as hosting forums and conversations with candidates and elected officials. Some of the activities that we've engaged in have been legislative meetings, testimony at public hearings, trips to the General Assembly in Richmond here in Virginia, networking events with elected officials, candidates forums, voter information and registration tables, candidate questionnaires, and General Assembly tracking and calls to action. I did want to share one of my favorite examples of some of the work that we've done recently, which was last year I had the privilege of working with a student intern from one of our local high school. And together we set up a student forum here at Herndon High School. So anyway, the intern and I worked together to invite a panel of 5 local elected officials, including the mayor, the school board representative, our state delegate and senator, and I'm missing one, county board of supervisors. Anyway, brought in this panel of local elected officials to engage in conversation with the students. So we had students identified who stood up and asked their questions in front of the audience, and then we broke them into breakout groups to discuss topics of their choice. It was really a cool way to work on that sort of next generation engagement with getting these students feeling confident that their voices matter and understanding how local government works, frankly.
That's awesome. Thanks, Amanda.
Yeah.
Mercedes, you have deep expertise in equity and systems change. What do you make of the relationship between equity and advocacy described in these research findings?
Yes, thank you for this question. I'll start off by saying pretty unequivocally that this observation at a high level doesn't surprise me either. At the Building Movement Project, I'll take a step back and say that we understand that advocacy is integral to pursuing racial equity and justice. And I see, I'm not surprised that you see that interrelationship between these two things. In fact, in our 2019 Race to Lead Revisited report, which is a research series that addresses the nonprofit racial leadership gap, we observed that respondents often rated their organizations more positively when they saw a real willingness of their leadership and their organization overall to address what we call root causes or social injustices and to take a public stance in alignment with that commitment. We saw this more often with BIPOC-led organizations, and we define that as organizations that are, I believe, 50% or more BIPOC leadership and having also a high percentage of BIPOC board representation. I think I'm going to dig in there just a little bit more. I think BIPOC leaders are keenly aware of the fact that they can't service their way out of whatever social ill or issue they're tackling through their actual mission work. They understand that in order to advance change, real change or meaningful change, i.e. systems change, they must be willing to double down and pursue changes to policies that are disproportionately and negatively impacting their beneficiaries or their constituency. The last thing I'll share is that at Building Movement Project, as we sought to understand this relationship more, which is, I believe, something that is present in your findings, that you see an increase of willingness to advocate when organizations have really put that stake in the ground. At BMP, we developed a nonprofit race equity assessment known as the Building Blocks for Change, which, as Akila mentioned earlier, is the body of work at BMP that I oversee. through our assessment, we're able to further explore the extent to which nonprofit staff are observing their organization's commitment to addressing racial inequity, both inside and outside of their actual organizations. And so I offer that I dug in deep in regards to what tends to be this bright spot, which is where you see BIPOC-led organizations, both in senior leadership as well as board representation. You often see a increased willingness to both publicly name their commitment to addressing structural and deep inequities, both in their external work as well as in their internal facing work. And in order to do that work and to really pursue racial equity and justice, they must be engaged in policy advocacy and funding advocacy, as that's probably their most effective tool, right, to actually bringing about the change that they're seeking out, rather than just solely focusing, on pursuing their mission work through their programs and services. So I hope that's helpful, and Emily, and what you were after. But I think that's the one thing that came to mind for me as I really grappled with the findings in your report.
Thanks, Mercedes. Gary, I'd love to hear your perspective on the data. Murray mentioned that some of the findings were consistent with some of your findings in the SNAP survey. Can you speak to that?
Sure. I know we're running a little bit behind, so I'll do maybe 3 points really fast, how quickly I can talk. First, I think the first point would be, I think that the top barriers that charities voiced in the SNAP research related to things like lack of resources, such as money, capacity, the training, much of the things, Amanda, you were talking about. It also, a second kind of barrier, if you will, was understanding the rules. The second point I would make is what we found was, even if groups had more money and more training, it doesn't necessarily translate into more advocacy. The secret sauce is what we were talking about in the research. The secret sauce is that a charity needs to see that policy advocacy advances the mission of the organization. That's the motivating factor. And we haven't, as a sector, the question was asked, how do we do more advocacy and build it? We haven't yet found how to best connect those mission-driven components to the work for a lot of charities. Mercedes, you've done that in the context of movement building and equity, but I think we have to think of that in a much broader sense. So PENS is really on target, I think, with that. The third point I would make is maybe we should start thinking about adjusting our way of defining and measuring advocacy to better capture social action today. Given gridlock, given the polarization in legislatures, it's quite possible that charities are looking at other ways of expressing their advocacy voice. It may turn out that the PENS research is spot on regarding the drop in policy advocacy through traditional pathways. However, it's also possible that charities are more engaged in other pathways to build movements, social movements, to build power, to build social change. Somebody mentioned in the Q&A the whole notion of measuring ballot measures, which is the people's legislation, if you will. So let me stop there.
Thanks, Gary. I'm going to try and shoehorn in one more question that we got in the chat. And this is for all our panelists. What would you say to someone who is uninterested or afraid of American politics, but is interested in mission-aligned impact?
I'm hoping that one of our panelists might be able to answer that from an organization perspective, actually. I'm really interested as well.
Amanda, I think I'm going to put you in the hot seat for this one.
Absolutely. I apologize. I was answering a question in the chat, which I probably shouldn't have done, and I think I missed it. Emily, could I trouble you to repeat it? Sorry about
Absolutely. So what would you say to someone who's uninterested or afraid of American politics, but is interested in mission-aligned impact?
Sure. I mean, I think that here at Cornerstones, we've always been cautious to structure our advocacy around the issues that we know mean the most to our clients and our community, right? So it really isn't about politics. It's about which what is happening, at the local, state, and federal levels that we know needs to be changed in order to create this community where our community members can thrive. And so while I think people sometimes feel turned off by conversations with elected officials or feel intimidated by it, I think that there are a lot of ways to get involved, and we've tried to create advocacy opportunities for everyone to raise their voice about issues they care about, politics aside.
Great, thank you. We're going to hop into our last presentation segment. I'm going to hand things over to Dr. Heather McIndoe, who's going to present research findings on civic and election engagement and coalitions and collaborative groups.
Okay, thank you very much, Emily. I'm Heather McIndoe from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and I'd like to start by thanking Emily again and Akila and Independent Sector for funding this research. I'm really excited to share the new survey findings about nonprofit civic engagement, election work, and coalition activities. And I'm going to begin with 2 slides about civic engagement and social movement activity. We found that nonprofits pursue many public engagement activities beyond policy advocacy. And this slide shows a range of civic engagement activities reported in the survey. The dark bars are nonprofits that engage in advocacy or lobbying, and the lighter bars are nonprofits that did not engage in advocacy. The figure shows that nonprofits engaged in advocacy also engage in civically in higher rates than non-advocating nonprofits. For example, if you look at the top of the figure, almost 60% of advocating nonprofits report participating in a community gathering, compared to 32% of non-advocating nonprofits. And interestingly, given our historical point in time, 20% of advocating nonprofits reported conducting a vaccine drive. In addition to advocacy and traditional forms of civic engagement, nonprofits also take part in more disruptive forms of public action, which Gary just referred to. This is referred to as social movement activity. Nonprofit social movement activities are organizational efforts to mobilize and organize individuals and communities around specific social and political issues. And the goal is typically to promote social change. So examples of nonprofit social movement activities include organizing rallies, marches, and getting petitions signed. As with civic engagement, nonprofits that report engaging in lobbying or advocacy, the darker bars on this chart, report participation in social movement actions at significantly higher rates than nonprofits that do not engage in advocacy or lobbying. On average, advocacy-engaged nonprofits more frequently engage their stakeholders to sign petitions, 17.8%, participate in marches, 11.4%, or participate in protests, 7.6%. So we do see other forms of public engagement, civically and social movement-wise, from nonprofit organizations, aside from, in addition to, policy advocacy. Now let's turn to election activity. Charitable nonprofits, if you recall from one of the former slides, 57% of nonprofits understand that nonpartisan voter engagement is legally permitted. This was back in Lewis's presentation. So charitable nonprofits, while prohibited from endorsing candidates, can engage in nonpartisan election-related activities, such as voter education and voter registration. Like civic engagement and social movement activities, we found that nonprofits engaged in lobbying or advocacy are more highly engaged in election-related activities than non-engaged nonprofits. The table at the bottom of this slide compares election engagement for all nonprofits, the second row in the body of the table, and advocacy engaged nonprofits, the bottom row. Overall, 13.8% of nonprofits conducted some form of elections work. This is only 1 in 7 nonprofits reporting some form of elections engagement. Participation in elections activity was higher among advocacy engaged nonprofits, with 32% of these organizations reporting some type of election work. Among all nonprofits, voter education was the most frequent form of elections engagement. And looking at the second row in the table, you can see that 8% of all nonprofits participated in voter education, 8% participated in get out the vote efforts, 5% in voter registration, and 3% in ballot initiatives. So they're varying forms of election engagements that were shown across our sample. Now let's turn to coalition work. One of the things that's different in 2003 than 20 years ago is the growth in the number of formal coalitions of nonprofits. For example, state coalitions now exist in 44 states and the District of Columbia. This slide shows a Venn diagram, overlapping circles indicating if a nonprofit reported belonging to a local, state, or national coalition. 41% of nonprofits nationally reported engaging with a coalition. And of nonprofits that belonged to a coalition, 31% are super engagers. And these are nonprofits that belong to all three types of coalitions: state, local, state, and national. And these are the organizations at the center of the diagram. About a third of nonprofits overall reported that they belong to a statewide association, and 20% reported belonging to a nationwide association. And looking across subsectors and organization size, we find that nonprofits that belong to coalitions range across subsectors from 40% in human services, roughly 12% in education, health, and public benefit. Again, these percentages are for nonprofits that report belonging to coalitions. Turning to organizational size as measured by expenses, nonprofits belonging to coalitions are mostly small and mid-sized organizations, with those with under $500,000 in expenses accounting for 52% of nonprofits that report engaging with coalitions. The very largest nonprofits with $10 million or more of expenses account for only 6% of nonprofits reporting belonging to coalitions. The coalitions can offer many benefits in addition to providing a means for advocacy and lobbying. And to understand why nonprofits join coalitions and associations, we ask the question, how important are each of the following reasons for your organization to be affiliated with coalitions or association? So looking at this figure, traveling to the right across a bar indicates higher importance of that factor. For example, the most frequently cited very important reason for joining coalitions is the bar at the top of the figure, to obtain information, with 57.3% of coalition members citing this reason. This is followed by for networking and peer interactions at 57%, and to amplify the voice of the people of my organization at 50%. 37% of nonprofit coalition members reported supporting or opposing policies that affect the people my nonprofit serves as a very important reason for engaging in coalitions. So here's a little more about coalition membership and advocacy. We find that a majority, 57% of nonprofit coalition members engaged in advocacy, and this is compared with only 12% of non-coalition members. Coalition members that report engaging in advocacy on their own at higher rates than non-members. So there's no crowd out effect in which nonprofits look to coalitions to do the bulk of their advocacy work. Nonprofits that belong to coalitions also report doing advocacy on their own. And this table, the table on this final slide, compares specific types of advocacy across nonprofit coalition members, the second column, and non-members, the third column. Nonprofits that belong to coalitions uniformly engage in advocacy at higher rates than non-coalition nonprofits. For example, the top line of the table shows that 70% of coalition members reported meeting with government officials to talk about their work, compared to 40% of nonprofits that do not belong to coalitions. Interestingly, 39% of nonprofits that belong to coalitions report discussing legislation with elected officials, compared to only 12% of nonprofits that do not belong to coalitions. So coalitions are an important mechanism for advocacy work, but they do not appear to substitute for nonprofit organizations' own advocacy work. Thank you, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Heather. Mercedes, building movement projects supports nonprofits to address social issues in part through movement building. Can you tell us more about how movement building intersects with coalitions and advocacy work?
Yes, thanks for this question as well. I'll start by being cheesy and reminding us that we are truly stronger and more effective together. That was ringing in my head as Heather was reviewing the findings, and I was just reflecting back on my pre-BMP work, which was steeped in advocacy and policy work. And I'll shift gears and come back to BMP now. So at the Building Movement Project, we believe that for systemic change to happen, we know that in order for some systemic change to happen, social movements are critical to fostering and building the supports that's actually needed to bring about that level of change. Social movements should and usually center communities who've been historically under-resourced and marginalized to build their collective power through a number of strategies. Just think about our movement building work at Building Movement Project, ranging from organizing, narrative change efforts, advocacy support, and some more direct actions, just to throw out a couple. Building movement projects on solidarity, which I'm happy to provide more information on, and social change support these movements, these effective movements through training, workshops, a podcast that amplifies the voices of movement leaders, which is critical to hear from folks on the ground who are effectively both building capacity for movements to be effective and for leaders and impacted communities to galvanize around very important issues. In addition to that particular podcast that I referenced, we also have a number of other tools and resources that are all aimed to strengthen the skills and capacity of nonprofits. I think, the findings that Heather lifted up are encouraging because it does show that when we actually better support and build out and really enhance the capacity of folks who are effectively advancing policy change and a deepened investment in programs and services that we know are actually the key to addressing many of the issues that they made their life's work into, I think the more effective the nonprofit sector will be. And so I'll share in closing. I could go on and on with this, especially given the work that BMP leads and is involved in. I'll just share the link to the resource that I was referencing, not directly, which is the Solidarity Is website, which is one of Building Movement projects. Where folks might find more information about our movement building efforts. I'm also happy to respond to additional questions that might come up through the Q&A. But I think just in short and closing it out, that movement building work is part and parcel, if not the actual vehicle that coalitions and advocacy groups must undertake to be effective in their respective endeavors to bring about the type of movement and change that they're pursuing. So it's almost like a vehicle is the way I was thinking of it.
Great, thanks, Mercedes. So speaking of being stronger together, Gary, you were part of a big collaborative group of grant makers and nonprofits who are working to ensure an accurate census count in 2020. Can you tell us more about that coalition work, specifically the role philanthropy played?
Sure. By the way, don't put it in past tense. The collaborative is still going. So yeah, that's the good news. The census is actually a great example, I think, of what I was talking about earlier, to examine sort of non-traditional pathways for advocacy and civic engagement. For those who don't know, although the US Constitution requires counting everyone in the US every 10 years, there's a persistent problem each cycle of undercounts, primarily among people of color, poor people, immigrants, young children, which, by the way, are the majority are kids of color nowadays. An undercount results in federal funds not going where they should, in community-based decision-making about schools, hospitals, highways, and more being wrong, in weakened civil rights enforcement, in a loss of political representation, and more. In short, an inaccurate census distorts democracy for the next decade. So accordingly, hundreds of funders, literally hundreds of funders, and more than 1,000 nonprofits built a collaborative, the Census Equity Initiative, to promote a fair and accurate census. The work by nonprofits, often who are the trusted voices in communities, to encourage people to fill out the census, isn't likely to show up in the type of activity under SNAP or Penn's research. But from my perspective, it's clearly about nonprofit advocacy. It's clearly about civic engagement. It's what Maya Cross put in the chat when asking about system change. Foundations not only provided funding in a coordinated fashion, they also served on local complete count committees, hosted meetings, signed a joint letter opposing the addition of a citizenship question to the decennial survey, and many other activities. As a funder, as an advocate, as an observer of philanthropy, I was impressed by what I saw. Philanthropy stepped up its game. But let's be honest here. Funders have a special role to play in encouraging advocacy and civic engagement through grant making, particularly in steps that they can take to help build what I think, Mercedes, the language you were using, I come up with inclusive multiracial democracy. And that starts at the community level, where Amanda was talking about things, where most charities don't have the funding to tackle advocacy activities, including communications and social media skills. Even joining coalitions that you were talking about, in the research, takes resources. The gold standard for foundations should be providing general operating support so that nonprofits have the flexibility to put the resources where it's needed. So let me stop by emphasizing 2 points on this, Emily. One is foundations have a critical role to play in supporting advocacy and civic engagement. And second, like the Penn's research found with charities involved in coalitions, foundations also can accomplish much more by working collaboratively. And I forget the slogan you used, Mercedes, but it's sort of more done better together, something like that. But it's definitely about building power, and it's when we come together that happens.
Thanks, Gary. Amanda, diving into things on the local level, does Cornerstones belong to any coalitions or collaborative groups? And if so, how has being a member of those groups impacted your work towards your mission?
Yeah, absolutely. I love this question because this is a really important part of how we do this work. We often talk here at Cornerstones about working through our partnerships and coalitions because that's how we do this work. Some of our partnerships are more formal membership organizations and coalitions, and some really are just more informal partnerships, groups and community leaders working together to get this work done. But as we've talked about, with a limited staff and limited budget for advocacy, we really rely on our community partners and often follow their lead with things like data and resources, messaging, and calls to action, because it really increases our capacity. We're very lucky to have an advocacy committee who's dedicated to this work, and we have strong relationships and deep roots working with our local faith communities. I think that's an important piece for us. Actually, we used to be called Rest and Interfaith, and we were founded 50 years ago by a group of interfaith partners coming together to address poverty and inequity in our town. And so we really have tried to carry that forward and see ourselves as this convener and thought leader at the local level, creating spaces for partners to come together. I think that an example I could share of working through partnerships is every January we get engaged with General Assembly advocacy. So we state level advocacy happening here in Virginia. We were able to bring a group of advocates to Richmond this year to visit the General Assembly, really because we have a good partnership with a group called the Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy. And they were great because they set the stage where they sponsored workshops and discussions, and they were able to set legislative visits. And so really we rented a bus and we brought our folks down and we showed up and were able to, educate people about our issues. We were able to get involved in talking to our legislators. People got engaged, they got excited. We were able to observe the Senate floor. And so it was a chance. There were things we wouldn't have been able to do had we done that all on our own, but through that partnership, we could create a great experience and make some change.
Awesome, thank you.
Sure.
So there have been a few questions coming into the chat that are focused on kind of capacity building and resources. So I'll paraphrase a couple of them for the panelists. How do we increase nonprofit capacity in order to encourage more advocacy work? And assuming more funding isn't coming into the sector, how can we invest in organizations to best able to advocate within those constraints? Thoughts on how we increase capacity and how we increase capacity with limited funding?
I'm looking forward to the answer to this one.
Well, let me just start by challenging the assumption that there isn't more money coming into the sector. I don't think we should think of this as a zero-sum game. There's new wealth coming up. And I think we have an obligation, a responsibility to educate those philanthropic donors about the importance of the civil society and of nonprofits and their role in fostering social change, and that it is healthy for our democracy when nonprofits are engaged. It's actually a responsibility to fund that and to make us stronger as a community to help represent communities and lower income folks. So in terms of the capacity, there can be dollars if we come together and make a singular voice and say, this is important to fund. I also think that, as I mentioned earlier, I think we have to do a better job in our institutions in connecting advocacy to the mission. We have to convince the CEOs and the leadership of organizations and the donors the importance of why, when you effectively advocate, you help carry out and better your mission. And there's been enough research showing that effective nonprofits are the ones who also include advocacy within its workload.
You know, there was something I was going to share. Is that okay? It makes me think that sometimes this work can be tricky to measure impact. You know, we get asked a lot about, you know, so what, right? What have we accomplished through all this work? And it's easy to measure our outputs, but our outcomes are tricky. And so support, I think, for us, and being able to paint a picture of why this matters and why it's important and how we can explain to folks like donors and funders that we need to be doing this work would go a long way.
Amanda now just rounded out with what I was going to share. I knew Jerry would hop right on that one and had a similar thought, but I think it sort of add to what the two of you have said, then we have to amplify those success stories, those profiles, those case studies where we see both single nonprofits as well as those belonging to coalitions and networks effectively bringing about systems change and deepened investment in their, you know, the root cause issues that they're seeking to address. And I think that's part of changing that narrative shift that Gary referenced, is the more folks are both funders, nonprofits, just getting beyond donors. I think it's really easy to say that they should really step in here, but the more we educate the masses on the deep and real impact of allowing for those more unrestricted resources that can be deployed in service of necessary advocacy and service of that mission for real, right? Beyond those direct services and programming, I think the more that we might see a large shift towards allowing for those types of funding deployments.
Thank you all.
It's too bad, by the way, that Nike's already claimed it, but my slogan for our campaign would be just do it.
And can I just add, I want to point to Sonia Campion's Q&A or comment in the Q&A as well. I mean, I do believe that this is ultimately a strategic decision, right? It shouldn't, the engagement in advocacy or policy should not necessarily replace other work that the organization is already doing, such as direct service, but it is one strategic direction to engage and impact your mission, right? So I fully believe that that's a discussion that should take place primarily at the board level. So, you know, one first step here could just be introducing the question to the board and really having the board grapple and engage with that, but also engage networks through the board to help fund that kind of work if the organization decides to go there.
Emily, do you mind if I piggyback on Lewis, or do you want to? Okay, you know, just from my own professional history of being in the sector a while, I actually have seen the change you're talking about, Lewis, of the siloization, if you will. You know, it used to be when I was coming up as a professional, advocacy and social service were connected within the same organization. And it was that the advocacy was influenced by the service delivery folks that were doing the work. So you knew where to put more resources. And maybe partly because of the way funding has occurred, maybe it's other reasons, but over the growth of my professional life, I've seen a complete separation. You know, you have the service delivery folks here, and then you have the advocacy folks here. Even if it's in the same organization, they're in separate worlds. And I just don't think for us as a sector, we can afford to let that continue. We've got to be thinking about the connective tissue.
Thank you all. We have time for one last question. And are there instances where advocacy and lobbying doesn't make sense to further an organization's mission? If organizations had all the resources and knowledge to lobby or advocate, should they? And that's a question for all of you.
I think this is a really interesting question because I think all of us on the panel probably come from the normative perspective that, yes, of course, nonprofits should advocate, and that even if it's not apparent, that there always is some sort of link to mission. So could there possibly be instances where it doesn't make sense for a nonprofit to advocate in a hostile political environment where they might be drawing more attention to themselves? Yes, I think that, and they want to protect existing income streams such as they are in that type of environment. Yes, it probably does make sense for nonprofits not to advocate. On the other hand, the answer to that would be to try to develop stronger relationships and go out there and try to reach across divides and make it really clear how a nonprofit's, what they're giving and what they're providing, and make that the message as part of your advocacy.
Thanks, Heather. Does anyone else want to speak to this question?
I'll just agree here that, advocacy or public engagement through advocacy and, formal campaigns isn't necessarily always the solution. I think there are other strategies along the way, right, that some of the panelists have already pointed to that don't take the form of formal policy advocacy. Sometimes that happens in the courtroom, so litigation rather than legislation. And sometimes it happens through, social connections and networks and getting just people out to vote, right? So there are lots of ways that I believe, organizations can engage. I think maybe the more important point here is that, organizations have this opportunity to engage and represent the people that they serve and their missions and make an impact beyond their services in ways such as advocacy or these other forms.
Yeah, I would just tack on. I think we all do more advocacy than we even know, and we do it in different ways. Louis, you highlighted certain behavioral things like litigation or other approaches that we may not have measured and so forth. But there are lots of ways. People, when we start talking about what is advocacy, we're ultimately talking about helping people to help our communities, help people, and help our environment to be a better place to live. And there are lots of ways of doing it. And some people would say research is a form of advocacy. Some would say, there are other things that you can do that help individual advocacy. Helping individuals with their particular problems is a form. So, Emily, I would answer it that more in the vein of we actually do more advocacy than we even remotely know.
Thanks, Gary. I think that's a great note for us to end on. Thanks to the audience for all your great questions. If we didn't get to your question, we're going to do our best to address it in our follow-up email. And I'd like to turn things over to Independent Sector CEO, Dr. Akilah Watkins, to conclude us today.
Thank you so much, Emily. On behalf of Independent Sector, I would like to thank our speakers for taking the time to share their insights with us today. This was a very rich, thoughtful, and deep conversation. And I walked away with a lot of just key takeaways. Some are, Mercedes, I remember you saying we can't service our way out of social ills. We need to advocate for system change. I thought that was so profound and so extremely important that, and I think, Louis, you were talking about that advocacy in no way is going to supersede sort of our service delivery, nor should it. However, though, if we actually want to change the material consequence and life opportunities for our constituents, we're not going to be able to do that simply by providing service. We have to engage thoughtfully and powerfully our larger legislative and political systems. And so I really appreciate you bringing that point and making it so crystal. And Gary, I must say, I too am old enough to remember when both service delivery and advocacy staff weren't as siloed, right? That when I was running a community-based grassroots organization in New York for 10 years, we did both, right? And I really appreciated the examples that many of you offered, especially you, Amanda, about talking about the various levels of government. Like advocacy isn't just at the federal level, it happens at state, regional, local, at community levels, right? And so I think that's an extremely important piece. And so even small grassroots nonprofits have a tremendous contribution they can add as it relates to advocacy. So I have just really deeply enjoyed this conversation, and I know that our participants also did too. So the fact that nonprofits' influence is declining calls for concerted and coordinated action by the charitable sector. Advocacy is about nonprofits working together alongside our communities. The good news is there are immediate steps nonprofit leaders can take to begin addressing these issues. We need to clarify the rules. There is a lack of clear and understandable rules governing nonprofit advocacy activities. It should be easy to understand what is allowed and what is appropriately prohibited. Contact the IES policy team to learn more about the need to clarify nonprofit civic engagement rules and get involved. We need to get out the vote. Only 13% of nonprofits are conducting nonpartisan activities to help people vote. That's despite being more effective than other types of organizations at getting people across the political spectrum to vote. As we approach the 2024 elections, it's important nonprofits don't leave any power on the table and develop their organization's voter engagement plans. We need to consider the power of coalitions. As we heard today, coalitions can help nonprofits work toward their missions, provide services to communities they serve, amplify their voices, share intelligence, resources, and workload. We encourage you to learn more about engaging in coalitions. We need to find long-term solutions together. The issues raised in this research cannot be solved by a single organization alone. We need you all to work alongside other leaders and share your expertise to help us devise long-term solutions addressing the challenges raised in this research. Please use the link in the chat to get involved. Together, we can ensure the voices of our organizations and the people we serve are heard clearly by community leaders and policymakers now and 20 years from now. I invite you all to Upswell this year, November 15th through 17th, to continue the discussion about harnessing our collective influence as a sector. It will be held in Dallas, Fort Worth, Texas this year. Learn more and register at upswell.org. Thank you again to all of our speakers, Amanda, Emily, Gary, Heather, Louis, Mercedes, Anne-Marie, and to all of you for joining us today. Please use these last few minutes to fill out the post-event survey using the link in the chat. Thank you.